DraftSociety.com presents a Premier League Draft Fantasy Podcast. Welcome to the Key Pass Collective, your exclusive source for the information, analysis, and advice you need to dominate your fantasy leagues. Come on in. We've been expecting you.
Hello and welcome into the Key Pass Collective. If you are new to the show, and I'm hoping that there are many of you who are new to this particular show because of the nature of this series here that we're going to be starting today. But if you're new to the show, we are brought to you by the DraftSociety.com, which is a website devoted completely to the draft fantasy football game, which we're going to be talking about here today. It's a site that has all of your rankings, your strategic articles, your advice articles, your statistics, all of it. Everything that you would need to succeed in this draft fantasy football game is on the Draft Society. And my name is Joe Williams. I'm the host of the Key Pass Collective. Normally, I've got some co-hosts here with me, some fellow travelers in this fantasy game to give some advice to you, what I would call more analysts than myself. But today they're taking the day off, as I'm going to just be telling you a little bit about this draft game. As we get more into it, let me just kind of explain. This particular episode is actually going to be the first in a series that we're basically just entitling Draft 101, which is going to be walking listeners through what exactly this draft fantasy football game is. There's also going to be sort of a companion reading series that you can check out under the articles tab on the DraftSociety.com as well. So we'll be typing up all of the information on various parts of the draft game under the Draft 101 subcategory on the articles page. But today, we are here to talk about what is draft fantasy football. What in the world is this game that you're referring to? I'm hoping that some of you potentially have stumbled onto this, and maybe you've played the official version of the Premier League fantasy game, the salary cap version. Maybe you have played the Sky Sports version of the game. Maybe you've never played fantasy football at all. Maybe you've played American fantasy football, in which case this is going to be a little bit more familiar to you. But regardless, I'm going to try to kind of explain it to you in a way that is pretty digestible and hopefully sort of pass along my enthusiasm for the amazing draft game that I've come to adore and love. But also just the fact that it's really a whole lot of fun. And there's a really rich and vibrant community that has sprung up around it on Twitter. So we'll talk about all that later in terms of the community and whatnot. But let's first just get into kind of like a general overview of what is this draft game. What is Draft Premier League Fantasy Football? So in order to just give you kind of a quick summary, what I would say is this. Draft Fantasy Football consists of leagues, right? Leagues of people who get together, ideally mates that you can banter with, but people who get together. And normally this is between 8 and 14 people, okay? I would say most commonly you're going to find leagues of 10 to 12, all right? These managers play each other in matchups, game week matchups, throughout the season, in head-to-head style matchups, okay? And the season ends with one of these people being crowned as champion, either by points in the table, so whoever's just top of the table at the end of the season, kind of like the Premier League itself, or you can also utilize a playoff system. So kind of like more like American sports, if you want to really kind of have that end of the season nail biter where anybody could potentially win and take the victory. So that's essentially, I mean, if you want to kind of boil it down into the nuts and bolts, that is what draft fantasy is. I think it's important to talk about the differences too. The differences between draft fantasy and the actual official fantasy game, the official version of the fantasy game, and some of the other like salary cap games that are more common out there. So let's get into that a little bit, and I'll kind of just explain how the draft game is different, not always superior. I mean, of course, I would say and I think we at the Draft Society, clearly by the name, we tend to enjoy the draft game more than we enjoy the official version. But there are some definitely good and interesting aspects to the official salary cap version of the game. One of those, I think, is the fact that there are global standings. You can see where you rank against literally everybody in the world. That's pretty cool. You got to admit that's pretty cool, right? I mean, on the flip side of it, I guess, I would argue that, like, it's not always cool, like, knowing that you're, like, 1,478,032 number in the world, or, whatever the number is. But the global standings are still pretty cool. They're still pretty neat. So, of course, the draft game does not have global standings. Your standings are literally just where do you rank in your particular league with your particular friends or the people that you are playing against in that league. That is all that matters in that moment, is who are you beating? Who do you need to beat? Right? So that is a major, major difference. Now, no, there's no global standings, but I would say that, and I mentioned already, there is a really vibrant Twitter community that has sprung up around this whole game. And that really does, for me, gives me kind of that sense of connectedness. It gives me that sense that even though I don't have a global rank necessarily, I'm able to connect with people around the world and talk to them about this game that we love and get some advice, get some players I should pick up, get some players I should maybe trade for. It gives you this feeling of community. And, in essence, that is what we call it, is the draft community online. So, no global standings. Instead, you have the draft community online. I mean, it's a trade-off. Yes, it's true. But that is one major difference, right? There are also no prices. There's no player prices. Depending on what you use, like what platform you use to run your draft fantasy game, there can be prices. So you could potentially include prices. But I would say most leagues, the vast majority of leagues, don't include any prices. So there is not a commonly known price for every single player across every single league. Okay, so that is another major difference. Now, why are there no prices? Draft leagues are based almost entirely, or I should say, the competition comes from, the challenge comes from the fact that you need to personally place a value on players. You need to sort of predict what you think they're capable of and what you think that they can do and place that value on them. Now, it's not going to be a number value. It's going to be a value in terms of how early do you take them in the draft, which we'll get to in just a minute. But, or what are you willing to give up to trade for that player, right? So the value that you place on them is really, it ends up being more of kind of like a gut feeling. How do you feel this player is going to do this year? How do you feel that they're going to perform this season? And are you aware of something maybe that your league mates aren't? And can you get this player for pennies on the dollar, right? Even though there's no actual price, but can you pick them up off the waiver wire for free? Can you trade for them for a more reasonable price than you probably should be able to because you know something that they don't, or you're predicting something that your league mates don't know? Okay, again, we'll get into what all of these things are that I'm going on about, but just know there are no actual prices, right? Instead, the quote-unquote price you would pay for a player is how early do you take them in the draft, or what are you willing to give up for them in terms of like a trade or picking them up? Okay? So now we get to the draft. The draft is the main reason why you play this game. The draft is a holiday for everybody who plays this game. The draft is probably, maybe if you're married, your anniversary is up there. Maybe if you have children, your children's birthdays are up there, the day they were born. Maybe if you're really family oriented, your Christmas celebration or whatever type of family gathering celebration that you have, depending on your beliefs or your religion. Maybe that's your favorite day. But I would say this: the draft day for draft players is, I would say, among our at least top 3 favorite days of the entire year. Drafts are a mix of just nerves and adrenaline and just kind of like a buzzing feeling of happiness and nervousness, and it's all just everything wrapped in one. So for those completely unfamiliar, a draft essentially is where if you know anything about like the NFL draft or the NBA draft, it's essentially the same thing. A draft is basically just the players or the managers in your league taking turns picking players to be on their team. So a draft is essentially just a more formalized version of you all hanging out playing pickup football on the pitch behind your school and saying, I'll take you, I'll take you, I'll take you, I'll take you. And then, the last kid always chosen is very mentally and emotionally damaged for life. Not that I would know anything about that. But so essentially the draft, managers are taking players one by one. And after each round, so after each manager is able to choose, well, then the draft order flips. So the manager who picked last then goes first the next round. It helps to kind of even things out, give things a little bit more parity, give things a little bit more of that competitive sort of edge, right? You want to make sure that things are as even as possible. So the draft continues in this way, flipping every round, the order. And then eventually, depending on how many players you've decided that your league wants to allow you to have on your team, you get to the end of the draft and you have a team of players. From that team of players, you then need to, each week, basically set a squad that you want to play. Set an 11, a starting 11 that you want to play against your opponent. Your opponent will also have a starting 11, right? Now, hopefully, if you are sort of one of these official Premier League players, or you've been playing another sort of salary cap game, you are already sort of thinking to yourself that, wait, if you have a draft, if you go one by one and you choose players, well, that means that if my opponent has Kevin De Bruyne, then I can't also have Kevin De Bruyne. Exactly. There are no duplicate players in the draft game. So essentially, your league is drafting these players, and the players that are chosen higher are usually the players that are going to perform better or are known to have performed better in the past, right? And so their value, again, quote unquote, because, or in inverted commas for those of you overseas, their value is how soon you're willing to take them in the draft over another player, right? So no duplicate players. You have a draft. You're playing with 12, 14, 10, 8 of your mates, and you are engaging in head-to-head matchups with one manager in your league, with one other manager in your league every week. So you're only playing one other manager. That is the only score that matters in that particular week. Is what do your players score? What do the players for the other manager, your opponent, what do they score? And if you end up on top, even if you had a miserable game week, if you end up on top, you take the W. You take the 3 points in the table, right? And so it's not always about necessarily who scores the most fantasy points. Sometimes there's a lot of luck involved. Sometimes there's oftentimes a lot of luck involved. Okay? So in this way, you're playing a different person every week. You will repeat eventually because of the sheer number of game weeks in the actual Premier League season. But you're playing a different person each week. And that is the only person that matters. That's the only team that matters. You can actually focus on your opponent and plan your team based upon what are they going to be fielding for this particular upcoming week. So it adds a whole different element of strategy. And that's one of the things that we really love about the game. Now we get to trades. So given the fact that there are no duplicate players, there's got to be a way for you to modify your team to get different players on your team. Well, one of the ways you can do that is by picking up players, which we'll get to that in just a second. But basically that's, the act of adding a player that wasn't taken in the draft, right? They've got to be just out there sitting there somewhere. They're not on anyone's team, so they got to be available to be picked up, right? Well, they are. Absolutely. We'll talk about that in a second. But let's say you're coveting thy neighbor's player, and you decide, I'm sick of not having Kevin De Bruyne on my team. I want him. So you can actually approach that manager with a trade offer, and you can trade some of your players. Depending on your league and how deep you want to get into things, you can actually trade future draft picks. You can trade what we call free agent budget. These will all be different episodes in and of themselves in the Draft 101 series, but there's a lot of things that you can actually end up trading, but the most basic trades are player for player trades. You could even trade 2 to 3 players if you wanted to for Kevin De Bruyne, right? Or for insert incredible, amazing, league-changing player here. You could trade 2 to 3 players if you wanted to. So it really is in your hands what you want to do to try to get that player. If the other manager accepts that trade, boom, right then and there, it's done. Those players switch teams, and the players that you sent to him are no longer yours. The players he sends to you, welcome to the team. Lace up your boots, lads. Right? So that is it's essentially how trades work, and it can be riveting. It can be frustrating. It can be annoying. It can be enthralling. It can be incredibly, incredibly fun. All of those wrapped into one, depending on who you're trying to trade with. Some people are easier to trade with than others. But again, this is all part of the game. Okay, finally, let's talk about pickups. And keep in mind, we're still sort of talking about differences between the salary cap game. I know that while I'm talking about this, I'm sort of also explaining the draft game, which is exactly what I was hoping to do. But none of these things are present in the official salary cap version or any other salary cap version of the game. So pickups, as I mentioned, pickups are any players who were not drafted and are just sort of floating out there waiting to be signed by a team, right? So there's going to be a lot of players in the Premier League who are not fantasy relevant. They don't perform in a way where you would want to have them on your team. There's a lot of players like that. So there's going to be this pool of players just kind of chilling, waiting to be signed, waiting to be picked up. So we normally call these players free agents, right? These are free agents. And you can sign these free agents at any time. Sometimes the process is a little bit different. So there's 2 ways that you can pick them up. One of them is through free agency, and that is a period of time when it's just free to go ahead and pick them up. Yeah, grab them, whatever. Do it. Awesome. Pick them up. You got to drop a player. You got to drop one of your players that you have on your team, but pick up that player. Sure, go for it. Right? There's another time that's called waivers. Waivers is a little bit harder to explain. Again, there will probably be another full episode on waivers, but as a brief explanation, think about it this way. Okay, let's say that let's say that Roberto Firmino is still the starting forward for Liverpool. Okay, let's just pretend. I don't know when you're listening to this or what the news is, or if he's already gone to another team, but I don't really care. Just play with me. Think about this. Okay, he's the starting forward for Liverpool, and you're watching the match. And during the match, Firmino goes down with an ACL tear. And you know that the only real replacement for him is Diogo Jota. Right? And if you were to pick up Diogo Jota right now, he's a starting forward for Liverpool for the rest of the season. Well, it's not really very fair if you're able to just do that during the match. Right? Doesn't that make sense? Like that, there's got to be a line. So what happens is, in the draft game, players actually lock. So all movement is locked at a certain time, basically when the match starts. Although you can change the lock time to when the first match of the game week starts. You can change it to an hour before the first match of the game week. But I like to leave it until the various matches kick off. So you can actually manipulate your team up until that kickoff time. Now, when the players lock, they are locked until a period of time after all the matches have played. We know all the news that's happened. We know all the top scorers. We've seen some of these guys kind of come out of the cracks who we didn't expect to be like really good fantasy players, but maybe they're going to be. I don't know. So now you have all the information. Let's say it's a Monday or a Tuesday. This is when leagues usually run waivers. And what I mean by running waivers is you put in a claim for a player that you want who is available, right? But it's not just always first come, first served. It's not just a mad frenzy. Waivers is a way to prioritize who gets what player based on a few different criteria, which again will probably be a future episode. But waivers is a way to prioritize that so that players are awarded or divvied out from the free agent pool to certain managers, depending on what criteria they meet and what waiver priority they have. So waivers happen. Once that happens, then all players become free agents, right? And so then you can pick them up at your leisure and keep doing so up until the matches begin. Okay, so these are the major differences between the salary cap games and the draft game. I'm hoping it's apparent, right, that a lot of these differences make for a lot more engagement, and they make for just a really kind of more fun, a little bit more nervy, but in a good way, experience to the game, and just more head-to-head engagement with actual human beings instead of just where you rank among millions of people, right? Nothing against the salary cap games. I don't personally enjoy them all that much, but I see why people do. I get it. I love the draft game because it's this type of personal engagement, banter, this type of like actual head-to-head matchups that create such a level of like just fun anxiety. I know anxiety is always a bad word now in our society, but a fun level of anxiety and anxiousness and engagement that is just sort of like an edge of your seat, really good time. So these are the major differences between the salary cap games and the draft game. And like I said, I hope that I've sort of like communicated to you why it can be so enthralling, why it can be so riveting. So if you are new to this game, well then what are your next steps? This sounds interesting to you. This sounds like something you want to check out. Sounds like something you want to pursue. What are your next steps? First and foremost, you need to get your mates together or find a group of people that you can play with. Of those people then, you need to make sure you have one person who's willing to kind of get to know the ropes, willing to sort of like get their feet wet, get down and dirty, get into the muck with sort of the logistics of the game, right? Really click around on the site, whatever the site is that you've chosen that you're going to use. You need somebody who's willing to do that, to really get familiar with that. That person's going to be your commissioner, okay? So your commissioner is going to be the one who, on the back end, kind of within the system, will make any changes you need to be made, will reverse any trades that maybe accidentally went through, can change scoring if that's ever, something that is necessary, can undo a waiver claim just in case somebody, did something accidentally or whatever it is. Your commissioner is the person that knows the system that you're using, knows the platform that you're playing on, and that person is going to be able to then be able to go in and make any necessary changes. So the commissioner is definitely somebody that you want to think through. You want to make sure you think through who you make your commissioner and who you nominate that person to be. Don't always just take the first person who volunteers. The commissioner does have a lot of power. Now, they shouldn't have absolute power, but your commissioner should definitely be a person who is moral and is ethical, because they are going to have some power when it comes to making certain moves on the platform. So just keep that in mind when you're deciding how you want to play the game and who you want to give the power of the commissioner to. Get all your mates signed up, right? And then once you do that, decide on a draft date. Got to make sure it's okay for everybody. You don't want anybody to what we call auto draft. This is where the system will just choose players for them. You don't want that. You want everybody invested in the team that they have drafted, right? And once the draft is done, that's when the beauty, well, the beauty is the draft, let's be honest. But once the draft is done, that's when the beauty begins. That's when the game starts. Then you can start trading. Then you can start picking players up. You can start, this guy's already injured. Maybe you drop him. Maybe you pick somebody up off the waiver wire. This is when the joy, the frenetic beauty of this game starts, right? And then I would also say, even before the draft, head over to thedraftsociety.com. Shameless plug, I'm aware. Head over to thedraftsociety.com. Click around. Look at the draft kit, which is almost 100% free. I say almost because we do have some operating costs. So we're hoping that some people sign up for what we call the Inner Circle, which is sort of like our insider benefits package that we have, full of exclusive benefits, various different exclusive articles and trackers and stats and things like that. But regardless, so much free stuff on there too. So thedraftsociety.com. Then make sure you get yourself a Twitter account if you don't have one already. Head over to Twitter, #DraftPL, Draft Premier League, #DPL. Either of those work. Or head over to the Draft Society's Twitter account and basically just follow anybody that we follow. It makes it pretty easy, to be honest. It makes it pretty easy. Start asking questions. Tag some of the founders of the Draft Society, and you will very quickly learn who is going to be very active in this community. And it's not just the people involved in the Draft Society. There are incredibly talented, knowledgeable, magnanimous, incredible people who are members of this community. And that's the reason why we created this site in the first place. It's not because we think we are the be-all, end-all when it comes to draft analysis. No, in fact, it is more of an ode to the community that we created this site in the first place. So head over to thedraftsociety.com, head over to Twitter, get involved in the community, then listen to future episodes that are going to be upcoming about the intricacies of waivers, what does it mean to be a commissioner, trades and how do they work. All of these things will be part of the Draft 101 series that is upcoming. I'm going to try to keep this under a half an hour for all of you newbies just because just want to make sure it's kind of a quick in and out for you. But I want to thank you for listening. And I really hope that this has sort of piqued your interest when it comes to this draft game. If you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to direct message me on Twitter at JWillDraft. You can also send messages to the Draft Society and any of the founders. I'm talking the Draft Genie, I'm talking the FF Chaps, Draft Your Thoughts, Ryan Barnes, Toddy Andor, Adam Murphy, Luke Wilkins, any of them. They're going to be more than happy to talk you through this game. And also just hop on, like I said, on the community on Twitter, because there's a lot of passionate people there who would be more than happy to share their love of this game with you. All right, here is to you. Here is to many fond draft memories to come. And again, welcome to the community. We love to have you. Cheers.